Well, a happy good morning to you all. I hope you slept well and dreamt about oneness. And so I thought about it some more in between sleep naps. And since that's the theme of our dialogue today, I thought I would go into certain aspects of oneness. That's what I hinted at a few of them last night. It's one of those mysteries that is so simple that you can't possibly get any grasp of it at all, except sort of circulating, looking at it, something like a diamond that you look at from different facets, same diamond, but you see it from different aspects and you get different colors and different reflections and so on. So that's the kind of reflection that I'm going to be engaged in this morning. There's so many wonderful facets to it that it is a little arbitrary to know where to begin. But perhaps the best place to begin is with ourselves, and maybe more specifically with you. So if I ask the question, who are you, casually, what would you say? Any volunteers? Well, I should tell you, I'm not interested in your name and address as much as I am in other aspects of you. But you are, I suppose, your resume and what you make out in a doctor's office about your family, diseases, and medical history, and perhaps education, or what you make out when you apply for a job. So, in general, a resume is what we usually respond. Who are you? I'm an American. I went to CCNY. I spent a year in doing this or that, etc. This is what we might call the you that is most upfront that people see first, or you tell them about. But now if I shift the emphasis just a shade and say, well, really, who are you? Since I'm not interested in your resume as such, it's so superficial. Then we're talking about your ego. And the ego involves the false self, the idealized self-image, and this is the persona or the personality that we've come to habitually present as ourselves and who we probably think of as ourselves. Who are you? Well, I'm me, isn't that obvious? And with these characteristics, my temperament, my number on the Enneagram, my ancestors, my dispositions, my desires, my hopes, maybe my religion, my hopes for the future, my plans, my destiny, my profession, all that. So these are roles that we identify with, or cultural factors that we've interiorized without evaluating their true importance or value in our lives. But this, I guess, is the self that we get to know on the basis of friendliness and then friendship, and it's certainly something you want to know if you want to enter into a deep relationship with someone, like getting married or something. If you remember in the film Casablanca, shown some years ago, but still one of the best films ever. You remember that after their intense romance in Paris at World War II, and they're trying to escape from the Nazis, and the Nazis are about to take over Paris. They meet, but the circumstances are such that they agree to say nothing about their past or what they did. But as things get more intense and the sirens are going off, he says to her, "But who really are you? I know so little about you, and what were you doing, if you remember that?" This is the person, the you want to know if you really love somebody. But from the perspective of oneness, this isn't really you. This is what isn't you. That is the true self. The substitute you, the imaginary or illusory you, that you come in contact with when you begin a serious reevaluation of your values, such as in some kind of a conversion or change of mind or serious decision, or in the face of death or something that really shakes you up, some tragedy or something. So the real you might be expressed this way: who are you underline, which is more than who really are you, but who ultimately, basically, are you? Who is the true self that I'm confronting or talking to here? And hence, where did you come from? Where are you going? Do you really know who this is? What would it be if you stopped thinking about yourself, or if you got thrown out of the things that are supporting your idealized image of self? So this you is the deep self. It's the spiritual self. It's the you that God made us to be, and for all practical purposes, we haven't met yet, unless you're on a fairly well established in the spiritual journey. And this is the you that we're sometimes afraid of finding out, because if we did, it might change the course of our lives, and we couldn't live with the other yous anymore. And I might say, this isn't the final you yet, which is what oneness is. But before we get into that, let's shift the focus just a second. We're talking about you in the individual. Now let's talk about you in the plural, sometimes known as we. So who are we? Now this is a reflection I don't know whether a collective group of people can do, because you'd have to all agree to do it. But if you had an intentional community that was looking for you, then you might all agree to explore this. And this always involves exploring the shadow side, that is to say, the dark side of the yous that we've mentioned, which are rooted in our evolutionary process and in our developmental process, in our cultural conditioning. And now we're understanding, as the research into psychology continues, that there's a collective use, that there are influence on us, Jung calls it the collective unconscious, that also affect our conduct, operating out of the unconscious level that the traumas of early life also operate from, only of a personal nature. When we repress some emotional pain that we don't have the resources to face yet, you don't solve any psychological problems, as you know, by repressing them. In fact, it's by facing them and acknowledging them that you can let them go. And so the false self, which begins to form probably in the womb in some degree, is that developing or emerging self-consciousness that has no experience of the divine or of God or of spiritual realities, and no reason to ask the use of reason here, to ask the right questions. So it's this little creature so vulnerable that desperately needs security, affection, and some degree of independence, some affirmation of its distinctiveness or identity and so on, that is creating a whole world of false ideas about itself, largely rooted in the search for happiness that is innate to human nature. The search for happiness is really perhaps the greatest proof of God's existence, because what else would cause us to look for it? It's the divine presence in us, the Spirit groaning, that we might awaken to the truth of the goodness and gift of God and of our invitation to enter into levels of human experience and development and happiness, beauty, goodness, and truth that we don't normally even imagine. So this little self that's developing becomes more and more self-reflective as its rational apparatus develops. So that when it's fully developed, you have this little brat, 7 or 8 or worse, and they get to be 12 or 14 and so on. And this is the only self that we know. Deeply involved in social relationships, status symbols, and whatever the cultural presents. And in this culture, as you know, which is so competitive, ambition and struggle and competitiveness are part of its chief concern, whether this is athletics or academic or social status. So this is the self that is the ego. Or even just the resume, as we spoke about in the beginning. And it's not in direct relationship to the yous of all our colleagues or contemporaries crawling around on the floor or competing in school or on the athletic field. In other words, we're still fairly limited in our understanding of ourselves. And that means that we have developed a I am, that is to say, an ego, which is the center around which our thoughts and feelings circulate, like planets around the sun. And anything entering into our sphere of gravity, so to speak, is judged on the basis of whether it can minister to our needs for the emotional programs for happiness, becoming demands for other people to respect our more and more outrageous expectations, to have unlimited security, that everybody love us, and to please everybody on earth, and to have power over as much as we can, especially God, if you could get away with it, which you cannot. So we're a bundle of desires that are going to lead us into human misery, because the desires are so fantastic that there's no chance of their being fulfilled. They're just so exaggerated. There's a modest value in each of them when they need to be moderately fulfilled. But a dependence on them for happiness is perhaps the central characteristic of what a false self feels like. And it's the only self we know, so we're not about to change it unless the motivation is pretty serious. So there is oneness then in human misery. And this is perhaps the greatest oneness that we experience in our unevolved state of consciousness. But oddly enough, this feeling doesn't produce compassion automatically. You'd think if everybody was caught in a swamp that they'd join hands and help each other to climb out. Not at all. The usual response is to push them into the swamp so that you can then own the real estate or something. So we've changed the earth from a Garden of Eden into an analog of hell, really, where everybody is out for his or her self as they conceive it, under the influence of unquestioned education or societal values. So now you have a society of false selves and a whole corporate ego complex that we call nations, or at least villages or city-states or whatever. So this corporate we is what is coming into an ultimate crisis with globalization. And there are enormous advantages of globalization, but there are also enormous problems if people are motivated by personal or local or collective, in the small sense of the word, projects for happiness, such as self-defense at any cost to anybody else. So, oneness then, in our experience, is oneness in human weakness in the beginning. And this is the oneness that God seems to have addressed in wanting to become identified with us. Now, perhaps the most complete view of this identification is presented in Christian understanding or theology when it reflects the gospel teaching of Jesus with a certain accuracy, or presumed accuracy anyway. And that presupposes that that God is so compassionate that it's precisely the predicament that the human folks are in that evokes the ultimate sacrifice on God's part, if we can so designate it, in which he gives up the privileges of divinity, speaking now in the teaching of Christian as presented by the qualified Christian teachers. God identifies with the human situation exactly where it is by becoming not just taking on a human nature, which because of he was free of the false self as the divine possessor of human nature, but he is giving up all the dignities of being divine that he could have maintained even as a human being. So as Paul puts it, he became a slave, or the slave of all, or treated as a criminal, and identified with every human being precisely in their powerlessness and weakness, and the impossibility of their discovering who they really are without the help of totally gratuitous that we call grace, which is a participation in the divine nature. There's one of the remarkable parables of Jesus, which are kind of wisdom sayings that describes this, is the one about the great banquet. And I'll mention this briefly because it is so central to understand oneness from the perspective of the corporate healing of the weakness and damaged state of human nature. We don't have to necessarily today, I think of it as just damaged. It may also be just unevolved. And this is an interesting contribution from the scientific community. If you accept the idea of evolution, then this is the way that God is creating, in which creatures themselves take part or kind of co-create too, either by accepting or resisting the forces of their own nature. But if they act in this world according to their nature, things work out fairly well, but not perfectly. The greatest mistake that God ever made, if I dare to say so, is to create anything. Because as soon as he does, that's the end of perfection. Because these things can't be God, and anything that isn't God has limitations or is imperfect. So once you start to create, especially when you evolve a certain degree of freedom, anything is possible. Why be surprised? God has infinite possibilities, and so if he decides to create, anything can happen. And that means the worst things will sometimes happen. Why? Because it's possible. And that's the way it is. Now, if you don't like that situation, try another universe. But this is the one we happen to be in. And in accepting this extraordinary view of the human adventure, which God, not us, has invented, we begin to have a light on who we are and that he doesn't expect us to be perfect. Perfection anyway is not a behavioral pattern. It's about love. The only thing that's perfect is love. And so anybody can do this if they address their false self and cultivate the true self, which is God's presence in them. God communicates his own love. And so to bring this to another threshold, there are two processes in the evolutionary scheme of things. Not all of these are scientifically agreed upon, but one of them is the idea of involution, which is the emptying of God, so to speak, of himself in such a way that he creates matter which is about as opposite of God as anything can be, since God is pure spirit. So it's as if God threw himself away into creation, a way of expressing his desire not to be God, or his detachment from all the divine prerogatives. Remember, there's no possessive attitude in God. Everything is sheer gift. So involution then is the movement out of God to what is farthest away from the divine essence, which probably would be matter. And the extraordinary project is to bring everything that has been created back to the bosom of the Father and giving it a share in the divine life, each according to its nature, so that everything now, not just God, can be divine, insofar as that's possible for the limitations of each creature. So evolution then is this immense attractive force bringing all of creation, including matter. So that's why Teilhard de Chardin, in one of his famous sayings, said that the Spirit is present in all of matter, groaning or moving it towards its final, or impatient to see it reach its final culmination, in which everything will be glorified and participate in the divine nature insofar as it can. So if God has taken delight in seeing what it's like to be not God by creating, and if in our case we have a certain amount of freedom and death, the only way God can die is become a human being. So the identification that this view of the divine nature supposes is that God wanted to be identified and at one with the human condition at every level in order to manifest the full extent of his love, which at the same time is infinitely humble. Perhaps this is the chief characteristic of God, the willingness not to be God. And this is the invitation to us to let go of, or to reevaluate any status. If God can give up being God, maybe we can give up being some a dime, big shot of some kind or other. Humility is the name of this game of the human adventure. And so, suppose now that evolutionary movement back into the bosom of the Father is underway, as it seems to have been from the Big Bang. Now, maybe there are other Big Bangs we don't know about, but this one is big enough for most people. And it's the only one we know. So now you have this evolutionary process of the matter becoming a universe with galaxies and all kinds of interesting materials that clash together in enormous fireworks of one kind or another, creating new elements until you finally get the elements necessary for life, protein and so on, and then someplace life begins in one-celled animals. So all life is said by the scientists to have the same structure. So there's a oneness in the very basics of life itself. And then you have this enormous diversity, and somehow life led to the veggies. Now it's important to realize that we are bearing within ourselves the vegetative consciousness of plants. If you're a lover of plants, you know that they have some consciousness. They respond to music and your conversation in some way not quite known to us. But they like the sun and other things. And they like attention, apparently. But the three things that vegetables can do, that the philosophical psychologists have pointed out, is you grow, you can nourish yourself, and you can reproduce. And these are all essential to preserving each species in its kind of life and to enable it to grow. Now we know a lot about the way genes transform themselves into different manifestations. And at some point, mammalian life occurred, which involves at least some of the senses as we know them, and then the higher mammals. And so the instinctual needs that I've spoken of earlier are present in the animal kingdom as instincts. They want to survive, they want to reproduce, and they want to have something to eat. So at some point then, freedom emerges, maybe from God's creative gift. It's hard to establish any scientific proof for that as yet. But it does mean that we have a measure of freedom. Now, when that happens, a whole new element enters into the evolutionary process. It's not just a question of God's design, it's a question of people who can do something else than God had in mind, or oppose it. And so just how much freedom we have is a question that psychology has been addressing. And one thing is certain, that the influences of the lower levels of consciousness that we have passed through is still present in us and has all the apparatus in the brain and nervous system to support it. Otherwise, we couldn't continue in this life. So no one can know another person's conscience or their full motivation. And so all of the world's spiritual traditions have the insight that we do not know the influences that occurred in the formation of the various yous of other people. And hence, to judge anyone else, and often to judge ourselves, is not appropriate. Now, as human nature evolves into the rational kind of consciousness, this is a triumph of evolution in which matter itself has finally become, or the universe, as one of the great anthropologists said, is now conscious of itself. So this is an enormous leap in evolution, and there's no limit to what that self-consciousness can lead to. And it's this is the place that we find ourselves as a species. But this is the point that seems to me important for us to consider with the new insights of science and psychology, and that is, how can we possibly deal with a transition period when we're coming from a vegetative and animal levels of consciousness that are irresponsible into a new level of consciousness that is accountable, that can reflect, and that is free to make choices, at least within some window of opportunity. How can we live in a tension, in other words, in which we haven't integrated adequately yet these instinctual functions into the specifically human way of responding to life, and especially to difficulties or conflict? In other words, we're constantly challenged from within to return to the irresponsibility of animal life if we could possibly get away with it. And we can't thrust ourselves into higher levels of consciousness that could provide this integration, such as intuitive and unitive stages of consciousness. So what we're looking at here is the meaning of life or consciousness at this point. And it's telling us that we are rejected by the earth and by heaven. So that the cross is a lively symbol of the human evolution at this point, where you can't go back and we can't go forward under our own strength. So we're kind of feel alienated from the identification with the species that our fellow animals had, and our rational life is not fully integrated yet, and we quite a distance from participating in the full spiritual life, such as angels allegedly enjoy. And so how do you live life with an infinite desire for happiness and an almost infinite incapacity to realize it? This is a terrible situation to be in. Why wouldn't God, if His compassion, try to do something to allay that? I even wonder if the incarnation or the offering of grace isn't actually God's way of asking pardon for putting us in this situation. It could not be worse. Animals have a certain peace because they don't reflect. And angels seem to be doing all right because they don't have this body to deal with. Okay. So God's plan apparently was to identify completely with the human condition precisely where it is. That is, in desperate need of help. Desperate. And so the false self responds to this by pretending that it isn't desperate, that you're going to live forever, that diseases can be cured by science, that everybody will eventually love me and all the rest of it. It isn't going to happen that way, but something infinitely better will happen. Because God, instead of taking away our difficulties, since He allowed it to happen by the natural evolutionary process, doesn't heal us by taking away difficulties most of the time. Sometimes He does, miraculously, but it's not the normal procedure. What is more extraordinary and more dignifying and more marvelous is that He loves us enough to join us in this human misery. And that's what the incarnation really means. Christ taking the lowest place in such a way that no one can ever take it away from Him. And so it's not our virtues so much as our human powerlessness that attracts God. Why? Because God is infinitely humble. He likes this is the way He is. It's not perhaps a question of preference, but it's the divine nature to be infinite compassion and love, tenderness, forgiving, motherly, considerate. And all the things that have been said of God that could frighten you, and there are plenty of them, it's just projections of our limited human consciousness projecting onto God. Our fears that come from our lack of security, lack of having everybody esteem us, lack of having a certain control. So this is called, in the Christian tradition, the consequences of original sin. And there are three of them, just to give you a touch of that ancient theology that is still in honor. And that is that there are three consequences, and one is illusion, that we don't know where true happiness is to be found. That's the way we're born, and that's what original sin was designed to explain. How is it that we come into the world in this impoverished situation without knowing God, which is the only criteria for where true happiness is to be found? So the developmental process following evolution suggests that God seems to have accepted the fact that this is the best way to proceed. Adam and Eve were created in perfection, but they didn't do too well. So God isn't going to make that mistake again. So to allow us to pass through this transitional period is the safest and most secure way to attain the objective of the transformation of the human family into the divine life itself. And so the oneness in powerlessness becomes gradually, through the spiritual journey, oneness in union with God. And this oneness is incomparable. And here, just to conclude on this note, is the parable of the great banquet. In Palestinian societies, there was only two social statuses: the very rich and everybody else, who were very poor, scarcely a roof over their head, and who were serfs or slaves. And the elite sustained their status by having great banquets with the more or less understanding that everybody would come and support each other in their state of life. So in this parable, as Jesus presents it, a householder of this character decided to throw a bash, and he invited his peers, and one by one they had something else to do. One had some cattle he wanted to check out that he'd bought, another had bought some property, and one had gotten married. Well, maybe we could say that was a significant excuse not to come, but they were all lame excuses. And so the net result is that this man, who's identified himself as part of the elite, is utterly rejected by his peers. 3 in Scripture is one of those numbers that indicates completeness. So he's completely rejected by his peers, which is the only real value in that Palestinian society. So he goes, has the usual response of anger, a subhuman response, or at least a response provided by his animal brain and apparatus, that saw this as a disaster. So he said to his servants, they didn't want to come, go out and bring in the poor and the sick and the afflicted in some way, because my house has to be filled. They've prepared the fatted calves and all that stuff. So this would not surprise the hearers, because we know that the Hebrew prophets more and more saw God as having a special option for the poor and the afflicted. And the poor person, whether not just materially poor, but poor as a result of human conditions or spiritual poverty, were his favorites, his special concern. The needy are what God is attracted to because of compassion, which is the tendency to reach out to what is most in need, a spontaneous, irresistible movement of one who loves as God loves. And so the hearers were surprised that they were invited. They knew God liked these people. And so they staggered in, and sat down at the wedding feast, but it wasn't full. So the householder, still under the influence of his frustration and anger, said to his servants, well, go out now and comb the streets and the byways and the bushes and bring in everybody you can find. Bring in the public sinners and the prostitutes and the white-collar frauds of their day. Bring in the mentally ill and the people nobody wants, the marginalized. And if they don't want to come in, drag them in. Okay. So they all paraded in, staggered in, drooling at the mouth, smelling to high heaven, homeless, people who lived under bridges, people nobody wants, or who we would never think of inviting to any significant event. So now apparently the house was filled because humanity chiefly consists of such people, namely us. And so now the householder has a double bind. He's lost his status with his peers. If he goes in and sits down with these people, he'll be identifying with their value systems, their concerns, and their problems, which means he would throw away the last shred of his honor by becoming the equivalent of another prostitute, white-collar fraud, bum, homeless person, or jailbird, or whatever. What did he do? Well, just to emphasize, in that culture, eating a meal with someone was identifying with them. That's why the Pharisees and the disciples of John the Baptist were so outraged when Jesus sat down and ate with public sinners, meaning he was identifying with these people, which is what, as I say, the incarnation is all about. Taking the lowest place. God taking the lowest place in the most humble and least intelligent race that we know of in the universe. So what does he do? He goes in and sits down with these disreputable folks. This is the meaning of the incarnation as understood in the Christian religion. God has become us exactly where we are, with our whole history of failure, weakness, or success that we attributed to ourselves, which is worse than sin. In any case, it's a whole revolution in understanding of the goodness of God and the extent to which God is prepared to be close to us, to remain with us. So it's not some prize packages that he went in to sit down with, nor for whom he came into this world. But as he said, I've come to save sinners, as one of Jesus, public sinners, or people who are marginalized. And the word for those who are lost means blotto, totally gone, hopeless. Nobody wants them. Nobody can work with them anymore. These are the people that God has reached out to in the incarnation, at least in that Christian perspective. And so oneness, then, has this underbelly of darkness as well as light. That God has taken this darkness into himself and changed it into light through the power of divine life, than which there is no divine love, nothing power. And this is why it makes no sense to be afraid of God. There's no basis for this, except they're a little nervous about meeting a new person, maybe, if you don't know him. But suppose you hang out with God regularly, then that will be dissipated as acquaintanceship becomes more at ease, and you can, with friends, you can put your feet on the table and smoke a cigar, and they don't mind. It's only acquaintances that you're a little afraid of, what their reaction might be. No danger of what God's reaction to us will be. The more in need we are, the more unmanageable our life becomes to us. So that it's what we're talking about in spiritualism. It's not a success story or a magic carpet to bliss, but in a consent to reality, the reality of ourselves as unevolved, as battered and beaten up day after day by our emotions that are still animal or vegetable. And I shouldn't say veggies have senses, that's a little stretching it, they seem to have some consciousness, however. So here is the great art of practicing oneness, to accept ourselves as we are, to forgive ourselves for not being the big shot that we wanted to be, or the saint, or the enlightened person. It's not being a saint or enlightened. That's too low an objective, although it's honorable. It's in being nothing that is the great call of the gospel. And Jesus puts it in this way. If you try to save yourself or your life, meaning the false self, you will bring yourself to ruin. It's an illusion. It's looking for happiness in the wrong place. It's not accepting our weakness and turning ourselves over completely to God. But anyone, Jesus' wisdom saying, goes on to proclaim, who brings himself, herself, to nothing. No thing, no object, no over-identification. Will find out who they are. So who are you? Nothing. It's the triumph of the spiritual journey and of the truth, without it bothering you the least bit. It's our resistance just to being who we are that's causing all our misery. Drop the false self, drop the identification with our roles, even our identity, and let God be God in us. And then the final or fourth you finally appears. The real you is God in you. Christ, which is the Christian name for God, is living in you. And as Paul puts it, I live now, not I, but Christ lives in me. Lives in me at the deepest level, but in the spirit of perfect oneness, it's more than that. Christ is you. And that's why we have to see our neighbor as ourselves, love them as ourselves, and relate to God in them. So charity is God in us, serving God in others, and receiving God in others by their service of God in us. And in this sense, God is all in all. And the everything ultimately is one in the infinite.